Do you know where you are right now?
I'm in a drug trial.
What do you think is wrong with you?
I'm sick. But I don't matter.
That's Emma Stone and Jonah Hill participating in a futuristic drug experiment in the Netflix series Maniac.
What would you say this trial is showing you about yourself?
Is this therapy now?
It's not therapy. It's science.
Science, indeed. I mentioned that the show is futuristic, but it's cleverly not futuristic because, as many of you know, the history of government-sponsored, pharmaceutical-based social engineering, mind control stuff is well established. We might even take it one step further, as today's guest Robert Forte does, and say that the history of psychedelic drugs is a microcosm of the history of religion. I really want to understand how you're juggling these two things, because what I hear from Wasson is this both and kind of thing. Yeah, he's a lion-ass CIA lifetime player, yes. But I also get the sense that he's someone who either before, during, or after is woken up to the larger reality that he's stumbled into or that he's been pushed into. Or
Well, I'm glad you put it that way because I'm still kind of, I think back to my meetings with Wasson. He had a very peculiar personality around me. I mean, I think there was some genuine affection and respect for me as a young man who really wanted to understand what was going on. I don't really know. I'd really love to go back into his archives and read more of his letters. But I gave a lecture in New York shortly after my realization of his relationship to the American fascists. And then my access to the archives was denied.
now this is another one of those level 3 Skeptiko conversations that kind of goes in a lot of different directions, including the LSD movement versus the LSD movements. We talk a lot about Timothy Leary since today's guest spent quite a bit of time with him. We talk about his early history, his experience with the CIA, his claim that the CIA wasn't all bad in the early 50s, but then they turned bad and he turned against him. And I love Leary's quote that a third of what he said was bullshit, a third of what he said was dead wrong, and a third of what he said was a base hit, but a .333 batting average makes you a Hall of Famer. We also talk about Aleister Crowley and whether he really was the sick puppy he seems to be and how he's involved in this mind control thing. And of course, we talk about Robert's amazing journey through this entire psychedelics and entheogen thing, including his relationship with clandestine CIA operative Gordon Wasson. We also talk about Ram Dass, Neem Karoli Baba, and contrast Ram Dass to Timothy Leary in some ways you might find interesting if you're at all into that stuff. This guy, Robert Forte, is quite an amazing figure in history that you probably haven't heard about. Stick around for my interview. I think you'll really enjoy it. Today we welcome Robert Forte to Skeptiko. Robert is the author of a couple of books we're going to talk about: Entheogens and the Future of Religion, Timothy Leary, Outside Looking In. But more than the books, we're going to talk about how Robert has been right in the middle of this amazing history of the psychedelic experience. In the middle of it, really like no one else. It's an amazing story of just incredibly amazing life. Great to have you here, Robert. Thanks so much for joining me on Skeptiko.
Well, thanks, Alex. It's good to be here. I've listened to a couple of your programs, and I've been impressed with the kind of conversations you're having, so I'm really happy to join you.
Okay, as we were just chatting about a minute ago, we'll see. We'll see where this thing goes. We'll see if you're happy at the end of this, because there are so many twists and turns to this story and where it goes. And as you said, we've on this show explored this topic, and I've explored it from a couple of different angles, and not because I ever had my arms around it, because I still don't have my arms around it. And I feel like I've gone down the wrong alleyway more than once or twice. And to a certain extent, I was gratified to see that you kind of feel like you have too. And it's almost like you got to be the guy who gets duped in order to really understand the inside of the game thing. But I'm jumping way ahead in the story. Let's go back and start at the very beginning. Who is Robert Forte?
Well, we're not going to get into all that, but we will. Well, let's talk about my my career, my background in this field of psychedelics, because I have explored it very, very deeply on a number of levels, personally, kind of professionally, as a scholar, as a researcher, as a person that was quite involved in the underground movement. I've had working relationships with many, practically, well, a lot of the most significant people who brought this subject into public consciousness since the 1950s. And my own involvement in it, as you said, has gone. Like there were periods in my life where my first exposure to these drugs was one of just utter fascination when I was just a young boy in 1967. I saw a copy of Life or Look magazine with LSD on the cover, and I was just fascinated by the imagery. And I didn't know anything about it. And I was that was my day to do a social studies report in current events in my fifth grade class. So I brought this magazine in to talk about LSD. And I didn't even know what it was. And I asked my fifth grade teacher, what is that? What is LSD? What does that stand for? And she looked at me with this funny little grin, and she said, "Let's save democracy."
Really?
Now, yeah, that was just fascinating. That was like the only sign that the 60s happened in the area where I grew up, in this little suburb of New York City. Of course, that went right over my head. I had no idea what she was talking about, but it just kind of stayed there. And if years would go by, now I'm in high school and kids are starting to take LSD, and I was appalled. I was like a really straight young boy. I was a jock. I was into sports and nature. And I saw kids that would take this LSD stuff and they would just get too freaked out, and they would sort of wander off into these cul-de-sacs and kind of lose their way. And I vowed I would never go near any of these kinds of drugs. They were just frightening to me. And it wasn't really until my third year of college that I began to change my mind. I had, by this point, become a student of religion. I had taken up a meditation practice. I was exploring Buddhism. And
you were doing TM, right?
First, it was transcendental meditation. And then I decided to really understand, where did these techniques come from? Meditation had a very profound and beneficial effect on my life. And so I was a student at Columbia University, and I wanted to understand what was the history of these techniques. And that's when I learned about the theories about psychedelics and the origin of religion. And I thought, wow, I've overlooked something here. And I began to read voraciously. And then after many books, I decided I would try one. And I had a mushroom experience that was mild, but very interesting. And it was time for me to move to California. Just at that point in my life, to get away from the East Coast. And I came out to finish my degree at the University of California in Santa Cruz. And I had the very great fortune to connect there with Frank Barron. Now, I don't know how much you or your listeners know about Frank Barron, because he's been a very quiet but very significant force in American psychology, and particularly in really starting the psychedelic movement.
Yeah, he's really the forerunner to, I mean, everyone thinks of Leary when you have a whole book on Leary, and you were with Timothy Leary for the last 3 years of his life, and you know all his associates. We're going to talk about that. But tell folks a little bit about Frank Barron, because folks don't know. He's kind of the pivot guy from the beginning.
He's the pivot guy, but let me just back up a second, because I use this phrase, the psychedelic movement. And I'm backing off that phrase, and I think it's much more important to talk about psychedelic movements, because although it's one family of drugs, there are really many very, very different groups of people, individuals and groups of people who use these drugs for wildly divergent purposes. So I want to be careful when I talk about psychedelic movement versus psychedelic movements. Now, Frank Barron was Timothy Leary's best friend in graduate school. They both went to Berkeley together. He was a veteran of World War II, and he was horrified by the advent of the nuclear bomb. And he realized that, like a lot of people realized at that time, that, oh my God, this savage power in the hands of a humanity that, this was potential disaster. Albert Einstein said the same thing, like he shouldn't have done the research that led to this. Human beings can't handle this power. And Frank realized that if we're going to have this bomb, we're going to need an equal, expansion of wisdom and compassion and understanding, or we're going to blow ourselves up. And so he devoted his career in psychology to this sort of thing. And when he discovered these mushrooms while studying creativity in Mexico, he thought that he had found kind of the holy grail to psychology, that this was a way to just, release a corresponding, expansion of consciousness that would counter the bomb. He was really into this, and he told his friend Tim about it. This was the thing that they were looking for.
This is when? What year would this be?
Well, this is about 1950. Late. They were at Berkeley in the 1950s, and Frank finally connected with the mushroom about 1958, I think it was. And he told Tim about it, and Tim was in a rough spot in his life. He had his wife had just committed suicide. He was completely disillusioned with American psychology. He had already realized that the field was infiltrated with CIA operatives and CIA money. He was appalled at the apathy of the profession, that this was turning into a mind control enterprise. He realized this early on, and he dropped out. He took a sabbatical leave, and Frank finally persuades him to try the mushrooms.
Let me just interject here, because I'm going to have a million questions, so I don't know how I'm going to do this and how we're going to get some flow. But there's a lot of little details that need to get filled in for me as I try and understand this. Leary is sniffing out the MK Ultra stuff that's starting in the 50s. Okay. How is that? Do you have any more insight into how that is playing out for him? What he sees, what he's kind of upset about, and what are the origins of some of those projects? Because folks need to know that that's documented at this point, that they're all in psychology. So Northwestern is one place, and we had a guy on who's doing a fantastic documentary on Padraich, and so all the guys at Northwestern are pulled into this. There's hundreds of different facets of the MK Ultra program, a lot of different money being spread out everywhere. What was his, at this point, early on, before the LSD thing, what was he feeling about the MK Ultra stuff?
Well, it wasn't quite MK Ultra yet at this point, but I'll give you a couple of good sources. First of all, there's Frank Barron's a kind of memoir called No Rootless Flower. And Frank mentions in there how when they were at Berkeley, they realized that all this government money was coming in. And it was, back up a little bit further. So we had the OSS that at the end of World War II, it didn't exactly disappear. It kind of split into the CIA, the Harvard Psychology Clinic, and the Institute for Personality Research and Assessment at Berkeley. And Frank writes about this in No Rootless Flower. Tim writes about this very candidly and with his classic just Irish wit and humor in his book, The Intelligence Agents, where he writes about, he calls it the federal bureaucracy. And he and Frank were like, they were aware of this, They were kind of ambivalent. They were delighted to be receiving money, but they were also, Frank was a veteran of actual combat in World War II. Tim was in the service, but didn't really see action. But they were aware of like the psychology of fascism and the authoritarian personality and democracy versus authoritarianism. And this is what they had devoted their careers to. So they were kind of conflicted here. Like, here's the government kind of secretly funding psychological science, which could have disastrous effects on a democracy in terms of mind control. But Tim really kind of woke up to it. And he mentions this in his, really brilliant and important autobiography called Flashbacks, which is, I know I just said it was brilliant and important, but it's also full of exaggerations and false stories. But Tim talks about being recruited in, I believe it's as early as 1947 by Cord Meyer. Now, I don't know how much you know about who Cord Meyer is, or
just
your
a little
listener.
bit.
Okay, so Cord Meyer is a very important person in this post-war period. And he was basically one of the original, officers, founders of the CIA. And he started what's known as Operation Mockingbird, which was one of the most pervasive and continues to this day operations of the CIA, which is the infiltration of the American media, all media. I mean, television and newspapers and movies and book publishing and university faculties and
hello, Anderson Cooper. Right.
Exactly. And how Tim writes about how Cord Meyer approached him to recruit him to basically spy on Americans, because they wanted to know if there were going to be any uprisings against the, they're starting to rev up the Cold War and trying to introduce these memes of fear to the Russians are trying to get us. And, you make a population afraid, they're easier to control. And they're just starting these kinds of operations. And Tim was recruited to be part of this. Now, Tim, in Flashbacks, says he didn't want any part of it. And it was really what alerted him and Frank to the fact that the war was not over, that the war had really moved over here. And this is something that, I gather your listeners are hip to this, but, a lot of Americans are not really very savvy about the end of World War II and the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency and really what we're up against here. I mean, a lot of Americans think that we have a problem now that Donald Trump is president, that fascism may come to America. Well, I've got news for you. Fascism came to America in the mid-1950s, or even a little bit earlier with the creation of the CIA.
There's a lot there. And boy, I mean, we could go into the whole Galen thing and the whole paperclip thing, and we should, I guess, maybe a little bit, and the Alan Dulles thing, and where he pops up and all the rest of that. Now, I don't know how far deep we want to get into it. And I also kind of want to throw a whole other, log on the fire, if you will, too, because one of the things that I've turned up, so I've gone down a couple of different paths on Skeptiko. I really first started going down the parapsychology path, so if you look at what our friends in the CIA and the intelligence organizations were doing in terms of that aspect of mental phenomena, remote viewing, and then later on in the men who stare at goats kind of thing, but it's all another facet of this whole operation. And then I also stumbled across some great work done by a researcher in Canada named Grant Cameron, who uncovers this through Freedom of Information Act in Canada, a document from Wilbert Smith in the 1950s, who is the highest ranking intelligence officer in Canada responsible for aerial phenomena, and not UFOs at this point, but just, hey, anything that's going on in the skies or in the radio waves of Canada. And he starts having contact like experiences and observations. And he goes to his bosses, and his bosses say, hey, you better go down to our friends down there in the U.S. and see what's going on. And this is going to relate back to this story in some important ways. So he goes down there and he meets with, according to his memo, which again is a top secret memo that kind of accidentally slips out of the FOI of Canada. And it says, I met with the highest ranking officials. I met with Vannevar Bush. I met with all the top guys. The UFO thing is real. It's the highest priority among American intelligence. And here's the kicker that ties back to this. It speaks to a mental phenomena that connects us to these sightings. So from the beginning, they're interested in how ET is working in this extended consciousness realm. So I just throw that, like I say, as another log on the fire, because I get the social engineering to control people definitely in play. The rise of the Fourth Reich kind of thing, definitely in play. Dulles is totally in bed with those guys. They see this as, hey, yeah, the Nazis are Nazis, but, they had some pretty good ideas there in terms of how to control people, and their own social engineering program and their own program with the psychology and all the rest of that. But so there's just so many different facets of that. And the other thing I just wanted to throw out there before I let you get back to it is, the Timothy Leary story doesn't exactly pass the sniff test of, all these guys who get co-opted by the CIA, which I forgive them for all that, because it's totally natural. One, you have to make a living, and two, back in the 50s, people didn't really know what we know now. But when he says, he's like all these people, oh, I resisted. It's like, really? You resisted? I mean, I don't know. What do you think of any of that stuff, Robert?
Well, I mean, wow, there's a whole lot right there, Alex. You mentioned ETs and psychic phenomena, and the ETs are really like the in some ways the deepest level of this, and they may be directing some of these nefarious forces, but there may also be positive ETs, and then we may start to have to kind of look at American history as like a Star Trek episode, which is sort of ironic in a way. Tim's ash is being fired up into space with Gene Roddenberry. And then what you say about, like when I asked Tim, and I got to spend a lot of time with him. I knew him since 1981 was when we first met. I was myself wanting to do research with psychedelics at that point, and the story was that he kind of blew it for everyone. Even Frank kind of thought that. And that was my position, that, he was just too outrageous and too controversial and too political, and advising kids to take all these drugs was just craziness, and the government had to make them illegal. I bought that story. But as years went on for me, I began to realize a whole nother level to it, and I began to see a kind of method to his madness. But anyway, I'm getting back to the CIA here, and when I would talk with Tim about it, that's exactly what he would say. He said, I'll never forget, he said, Robert, back in those days, meaning the 50s, the CIA was not all bad, and that they hadn't really become what we think of them now. And I'm inclined to think that Tim was sort of duped, and that he was funded by the CIA, he was advised by the CIA, but he wasn't really that aware of how he was being used by the CIA. And I believe that really shifted with his relationship with Mary Pinchot Meyer, which is one of the most interesting stories.
Yeah, tell that story.
Well, first I want to refer you guys probably know what I think is one of the most important books on this is called Mary's Mosaic, and it's written by a man named Peter Janey, who is become a very close friend and kind of mentor of mine. And I was fascinated by this story when I first heard it. And the story is basically that when Tim is still a lecturer on the Harvard faculty, and just starting to kind of publicize what's going on with psychedelics. We hadn't gotten that outrageous yet. He's visited by a woman named Mary Pinchot Meyer. Now, I had already mentioned in this conversation Cord Meyer, one of the founders of the CIA. Mary Meyer was his estranged wife, and she was a force to be reckoned with, a beautiful, sophisticated woman, also from a very powerful family. And she comes to Timothy Leary's office and says that she has some friends in Washington who are very powerful men, and they've taken an interest in his research. And they've sent her to get some of this psilocybin pills from him and to turn them on. And Tim first kind of brushes her off. It's 1950s. He says, psychedelics are why don't you send the men here directly? And she says, oh, no, that's out of the question. Well, it turns out that Mary Meyer is the lover and close confidant of President Kennedy, not just one of these women that he fucks in the closet, but, a very serious, deep friendship and confidant and lover. And so she goes and turns JFK onto psilocybin. And this is in the spring of 1963, at a very, very poignant time in his administration. And it seems that these experiences kind of catalyze and accelerate JFK's awakening, his separation from his father, his own sense of his own power, and a kind of radical departure from the Cold War policies that he was elected under. He begins a secret correspondence with Khrushchev. He realizes he's being betrayed by the CIA. He gives considered by many the most important speech ever given by an American president, the peace speech, in which he bypasses his CIA advisors. It doesn't even have the speech vetted and just announces really this relationship with Khrushchev, the end of the Cold War, the beginning of a cooperative space program. And you listen to that speech, and it's like a mystic talking and he's talking about how we breathe the same air. And this is really, so it's interesting because this mushroom experience catalyzes JFK's awakening, but it also expedites his assassination.
That's all interesting, and I'm not going to dispute that because that might be true. But the JFK thing is just hard to pull apart because take the drug part of it. I mean, at the same time, he's getting these amphetamine shots from Max Jacobson to a level that is just insane. And he's a junkie at this point of the highest order, and he doesn't know it. And, it's back to the naivete that we look back on, and it's kind of funny and nostalgic a little bit to think that these folks didn't know what they were playing around with. And I guess we sometimes think we do, and maybe we don't either. But yeah, so yeah, I maybe I just put a little asterisk by all that.
Yeah, well, it's I've had an asterisk by it since I first read it in Tim's flashbacks. I read that in 1983, and I thought that was extremely interesting. I talked with all of Tim's friends about it. Frank Barron didn't believe the story. He thought Tim was making it up. Tim made up a lot of things. Other friends.
I don't question the story because I've heard that through another source as well. Actually, the guys who wrote the Max Jacobson book, and the name escapes me right now. The book is Dr. Feelgood, and the co-author that I was trying to think of is Bill Burns. One thing we will get into as this interview progresses is pulling apart all the different things we pile onto this psychedelic experience. And sometimes I think we attach stuff to it in these kind of noble, mystical kind of ways that may be true or may not be true, so, and we can pull that apart through the lens of looking at the life of people like Timothy Leary, and the good and the bad and the Crowleyan beast side and the Irish kind of street fighter for democracy, for liberation side, and also just kind of the cool guy kind of side, but also the ego-based side. So we're never going to talk about, we ought to just keep, I love that it's just going to flow and go a million different places, and it's going to frustrate the shit out of people. But I love how you're throwing out references to things, and I'm throwing out half-baked references to things, and people will create their own journey in terms of how to follow this stream of thought.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. I mean, about Tim, this is why I did the book I did about him in the way that I did it. I mean, he was such a mercurial character. He was part prophet, part poet, part madman. He had kind of psychotic and, really egocentric, narcissistic wounds, but he had a brilliance about him too. And there were times I remember, near the end of his life, looking at him, and he would sort of morph. 1 minute he's like a sparkly sort of Zen master, elfin wisdom and humor, incredibly funny man. Other times he just like had this twisted, pained kind of psychotic. You mentioned Crowley, and like very, very complicated. And so there's no real way to take a picture of him. You have to just take a lot of pictures of him and create a kind of mosaic of this complex character that had such an impact on the latter half of the last century.
Robert, can I get you, while you're there, can you spend a minute and talk about the Crowleyan demonic beast psychopath? So he says at one point, this is Timothy Leary says, I am the reincarnation of Crowley. And another time he says, I'm the beast. And he says, I'm a psychopath. And so is there this kind of, do you believe that there's some kind of demonic entity that he's invited in? Or do you think he's just playing with that on some extended consciousness level? Or what do you think's going on there?
Well, okay, so I've only really come to try to understand his Crowley period recently. And to be honest, I do not understand it very well, except to say this. And this was a phrase that Ram Dass put in my head, and I just love it. He said, Tim inhabited metaphors the way a snail inhabits shells. He tried he grew up, when he got into LSD, he then went through a whole range of different paradigms. I mean, first the order, but he got into Taoism. He wrote those psychedelic prayers based on the Tao Te Ching. He got into Buddhism. He did the psychedelic experience based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. He was a very scientific thinker. Yeah, he went off into this Crowley sort of way. He had a Catholic streak in him, believe it or not, that kind of came out right toward the very end of his life. Just a week before he died, he dressed in a tuxedo and went to Catholic mass. And I don't. I mean, Crowley, we could spend a month talking about Crowley and what a sick puppy he was, and what an impact he may well have had on not just Leary, but Aldous Huxley. And, what was the role of Crowley in this modern mind control movement that we're talking about? So I'm not really expert on that, but that's my thing, is that Tim never really took anything very seriously. He tried stuff. He tried it on. He got into it, and he left it. He famously said near the end of his life, he said, "Look," he said, "a third of what I've said is bullshit. Uh-huh. a third of what I've said is dead wrong." And then he say, "But a third were base hits, and that gives me a 333 batting average, enough for the Hall of Fame." That's the kind of way he had this wonderfully charming, self-effacing quality that I never spoke with him about Crowley, but I just get the feeling that he would, like almost everything else, except for question authority, That was the abiding theme through his whole life. It was about redirecting authority from institutions and leaders and gurus and ideas, and redirect it back into the human psyche, to take responsibility for yourself, to question authority, and to empower individuals. That's the theme that continues, that's throughout his whole life, from his childhood all the way to the end of his life.
Wow, that is so cool. And it's actually, as you speak, giving me a new appreciation for Leary, because he's the ultimate heretic. He's the ultimate Gnostic, creating better than the creator gods kind of thing. Can you spend maybe a minute? I'm just going to kind of pull you in these random directions. What is it that you found in Tim's history, his early childhood? I love this idea of what you're talking about, the kind of the ultimate iconoclast from the beginning thing. What springs to mind?
Well, I don't know how to answer that quickly. I'm well into a screenplay about his life. And when you ask this question, I just think of the setup he had as a young boy. He writes about it in flashbacks. His grandfather was, he said, the only sane influence on his young life. And he, up till he was about 10 or 12 years old, he was under the impression that his grandfather was the wealthiest guy in the valley in Springfield, Massachusetts, and he lived in this big house. And then his father was a kind of ne'er-do-well. He was a dentist, but he didn't really practice dentistry. He was a drunk. He was abusive to Tim and his mother, and he was just waiting for his father to die. Well, on the day that his grandfather finally does die, they find out that he's not a wealthy man at all. He's actually broke. And he just was able to carry out this impression that, the depression had wiped out this fortune. And so can you imagine that? You're a 12-year-old boy and your grandfather is your main archetype in your life, this authority figure, this beautiful, cultivated man. He turns out he was just a rascal trickster the whole time, and left the family nothing. And then Tim's father abandons the family, just takes off. He never sees him again. And what a setup, that is. That's really something. And so all his life, think of the relationship that sets up in your psyche toward authority figures. And, it can go on from there. I loved most, I have to say, his sense of humor and his ability to just be in the moment. And really the way he connected with people. And you hear this from anybody that knew him, when you got to spend time with him. He was a brilliant clinician and a superb psychotherapist, just for the way he connected with you, and he made sure you knew you were being heard and seen for who you were. And it was a gift he had to just bring out this quality in people. And toward the end of his life, there were days that there were just lines of people coming from all over the world to get one more hit of that Leary presence. I'll always be grateful for that.
That's awesome. Great story. I love that childhood story. I always found the suicide of his wife thing. What did that do to him? That has to be a real turning point. Yes or no? Or
yeah, that was quite brutal. His first wife, who he was very much in love with, killed herself in the morning of his 35th birthday. They'd had kind of an open relationship. They were in the 50s in Berkeley. He was a professor, and they were swingers. And they had a deal, you could fuck around, but you couldn't fall in love. And Tim kind of, went against that, and, had an apartment with his lover, and and they drank a lot, and she was kind of manic depressive. He had 2 children that he, loved, and she just killed herself, and it blew him away. And, maybe something he never recovered from. The innermost circle of his life is really very, very tragic. His son, Jack, who I got to know not very well, but we spent an afternoon together at Tim's. I flew down with Jack to see Tim about a month before he died. He hadn't seen him for 15 years. And so I was, kind of gently exploring Jack's sense of Tim. And, Jack was a really fine man, still alive, but he just, he thought his father was a psychopath, and they went through some, awful, awful shit. And then, of course, his daughter also committed suicide. I believe she hanged herself in a jail cell while she was waiting charges on attempted murder, something really terrible like that. And Tim was, Tim carried those wounds right up till the end of his life. I'm going through his archives with him and finding little, drawings that Susan made, and Tim would just break down in tears. And so, that innermost circle was very, very tragic and very, very painful. But he kind of made up for it. Not that he made up for it, but he tried to compensate for it by his next circle, because Tim's house toward the end of his life was full of young people, in their 20s. And he just, the kind of positive and creative impulse that he inspired in people, and like his extended family, and the love and rapport that he had with everybody was really quite remarkable. Yeah, very complicated character.
I'm glad, Robert, that we went down that little path, that little digression for a while, because we were speaking actually before we hit record button about how the reality of the social engineering part of this thing that you kind of got into, the OSS becomes the Fourth Reich here in the United States, and Dulles and CIA, all this undeniable, horrible, dark stuff that they're doing that goes way beyond any kind of license that the American people gave them to protect us, quote unquote. And then we attach figures like Leary to that, and we get all this, frustration, and also all this divisiveness about, CIA, he was a lifetime player, he was an actor, all the rest of the stuff, which there's some reality to, but these are human beings, and complex human beings, and really people who've lived a whole life. And I think that you fall into that category too, not with the CIA thing, although indirectly, I guess you do. I love your story. You get the call and you say, okay, my hippie ass better clean up, put on a suit, drive the Lincoln over, and see if I can get a job with this guy. Maybe we want to jump to that part in the story, because it kind of weaves its way back into this whole thing too, right?
Well, I think you're talking about Wasson there, right?
I think I am, right?
Well, Gordon Wasson is another, he's the opposite character to Leary. Now, your listeners probably know that Gordon Wasson was, that this psychedelic phenomena in modern America really started because of a few stages, but one of the most important events was the article in Life magazine in 1957. Life magazine, right? The most popular periodical in America that's owned and really operated, a very hands-on owner and editor of Henry Luce, right? So Henry Luce is a skull and bones guy. He was sort of propping up Adolf Hitler and Mussolini in his articles, and he wrote a very, very important paper called The American Century in 1934.
Back to your Operation Mockingbird, total insider. And what is the analogy we could give people who are younger than us to what Life magazine meant? This is where, like we talk about Camelot and JFK, which people can't even get, although maybe you got it a little bit with Obama and the halo that was around him. But there was this unbelievable halo around JFK, and Life magazine was like, the vehicle for plugging into culture, pop culture, but modern culture. It was everything rolled into one, right?
Yep, that's right. Yep, it was painting a picture for how to be. Thinking of Norman Rockwell paintings, and it was painting a picture. It was leading the way for modeling the ideal life for the American citizen, the consumer. We had just so-called seemingly defeated the Nazis. We were the world heroes. This very important concept of American exceptionalism, which predates this, but was really, fluffed up by Henry Luce to give this sense of American pride and how we were the shining light on the hill, and so there's an article there in 1957 by this Wall Street banker Gordon Wasson, who the culmination of a 30-year hobby goes to Mexico and finds this mushroom that's used in these religious ceremonies by the Mazatec Indian shamanists or sabia or curandera, Maria Sabina. And now millions of people are aware of this magic mushroom. I think that's the title of the article, Magic Mushroom That Causes Visions. And suddenly putting this out there. And a lot of people who study psychedelic history get this story that this is Wasson just like on his own independent hobby who has this discovery and writes this article. But much later on in my career, even after I had gotten to know Wasson and, visited him at his house a number of times.
But tell that story. That's such an awesome story. Talk about setup and talk about the strange ways that we connect with our own history, with our own path. Do you want to share that? I mean, just how that even comes to be and what that was like for you? And
you mean how I came to know Wasson?
Yeah, that story with the driving up with the Lincoln, I can't get that out of my head, I'm going to go meet this guy. And the next thing you know, it's so cool. He's invited me in, and now, I'm in his inner circle and I'm interviewing him.
Yeah, there were a lot of things that were happening during those days. It was I had taken I had a leave of absence from graduate school. I was at the University of Chicago Divinity School, and I had taken a leave of absence, and I was so very interested in seeing if I could help stir up this subject of psychedelic drugs again, but not a public thing. Again, I thought Leary had made an error, that I had recognized that that these drugs were incredibly interesting, but not for taking and go to concerts or all that 60s stuff. But by this time I was a serious student of the religious experience and realized that at the very root of our environmental crisis and political crisis was a spiritual crisis, and that if we could somehow reconnect with the ground of being, and people would start to wake up and understanding the interrelationships and the golden rule and philosophical and mystical notions like this. So I had gone about for a year or so organizing private meetings at kind of elite places. So one of these was at Harvard. I was spending some time. My girlfriend was a Harvard student, and I was living in Cambridge. And I went into Dick Schulte's office, and I said, "I'd like to have a meeting here of all the people that had done research with psychedelic drugs, who recognize that they're important, who don't want to create another hysterical thing like the 60s, but want to resume some of the more grounded scientific, religious applications of these drugs." So Schulte said, Dick Schulte's the great ethnobotanist, and he said, well, why don't you invite Gordon Wasson? I was like, wow, Gordon Wasson, that's like saying, why don't you invite Moses? And I said, well, and he just picks up the phone, Schulte's. I remember he even had a dial phone, and he dials Wasson's number and hands me the phone. And I'm like, holy shit, I'm talking to Gordon Wasson. And Gordon Wasson says, what a great idea. Why don't you come over and visit?
And this is what year, Robert?
This is 1983, I think.
Okay, so we're through the 60s and we're really through the 70s, which is really when the psychedelic bomb goes off, I think even more, because it really kind of gets out of control. Are we war on drugs at this point yet?
No, we're not quite war on drugs. We're in this little period, in this lull. Like you said, the psychedelic drugs were a big thing, but by the later 70s, they started to sort of disappear from the media. And there was a period there where there wasn't anything going on. And it seemed like a really good time to bring up the conversation again and look at these drugs and look at their use as adjuncts to psychotherapy, look at them as means to catalyze religious experience. That's what I was doing. And I got a little haircut, and I borrowed my father's Lincoln Continental and one of his sport jackets and drove down to Danbury, Connecticut, and began my rapport with Gordon Wasson. And, at that time, I was really in awe of the guy. And I thought that I'd read all of his books. His books are really, I still think of them as masterpieces, but I have this, which I'll get to, another layer of realization about him. He wrote these books about the role of the mushroom in many of the world's most significant religious and philosophical systems. The Vedic Soma and the Kikyon of the Eleusinian Mysteries, one of the longest running and most important mystical ceremonies of all of history, in many ways considered the kind of the bedrock of the Western philosophical traditions.
This is the Greeks, right? This is the Greeks who then went on the journey and the death journey and brought back, they went on a psychedelic journey, on a death journey, and they brought it back, and it changed their history. It was, the way that they made major decisions about how to structure their culture, how to go to war, all that stuff. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating and rich and went on for like 1,500 years. This is where the Christian Eucharist comes from. It derives from the ancient Greek, the sacrament of the Eleusinian Mysteries. And Wasson and Albert Hofmann, who I also got to know very well, wrote a book together on this, The Road to Eleusis. So anyway, Wasson was this towering figure, and I felt really just privileged and kind of blessed to be welcomed into his home, and he invited me to live there with him. He was near the end of his life. He was getting his archives ready to give to Harvard. Yeah, I was like a, kid in a candy shop in a way. And that's how that began. Now, this then takes another shift. So years go by. Wasson dies in 85. I decide to pick up the thread of his life. Now I've jumped ahead. It's the early days of this century. And I got the copyrights to his books. The state gave me the copyrights, and I was going to come out with new editions. And then I got a little money to begin to explore creating a documentary film about him. And I was given access to his archives. Not just access to his archives. I mean, they treated me like a prince, for Christ's sakes. Harvard gave me a corner office in the herbaria, and I had a secretary, and she would bring me trays of slides. And I was mostly interested in the photographs and all the mushroom stuff. But one day I just decided I noticed there was a file on his correspondences. And I decided to just kind of go off into there. And I asked for that tray. And suddenly I'm reading his letters. And I realized, my God, he's not just a banker. I mean, he's not a banker like a guy who deals with interest rates or retirement funds or something. He's on the very inner circle. You've mentioned a couple of these names. You mentioned like Vannevar Bush and Alan Dulles and George Kennan and John Foster Dulles. These are like Wasson's drinking buddies, Henry Luce.
These are the Fourth Reich guys. These are the originators, founders of the CIA out of the OSS, but these aren't the white hat CIA guys. These are more of the black hat CIA guys. Not that Wasson was, or not that we can ever put one hat or another on those guys, but continue with the story, I just want to add that context that there.
Yeah. It was quite a thing for me. I'm there in Cambridge. I was actually staying with a person. I don't know if we're going to get a chance to talk about him, Rick Doblin, who is the founder of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies and a former research subject of mine. That's how he got MDMA. But I was a guest in his attic, and I was spending my days going through these archives, and it was really like I thought, wow, that's really, really interesting that this is, and that nobody knew this, like the legend of Wasson, just kind of, people didn't know this, or it was glossed over. It was curious enough that a psychedelic movement was started by a Wall Street banker. But this is, again, not just a banker. Like JP Morgan is a bank, but it's really more like a major political force. I mean, Morgan was, one of the guys behind the near coup d'etat that removed Roosevelt from office, another incident in American history that people are, unaware of, that Smedley Butler wrote, a very important book about.
You can go on YouTube and actually watch the video of Smedley, who was the most decorated U.S. Marine, and I think still is in history, who was recruited by these folks to say, hey, wouldn't it be better if we kind of got Roosevelt out of there and put someone else in there, which in some ways is a precursor to the JFK thing, where Dulles is just smack dab in the middle of that, because as you alluded to, JFK is going to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces. And then who winds up? This is always this history. When people don't know this history, I just have to chuckle. It's like, you know what? I can't go back and fill in all the gaps for you, but go for yourself. Who is responsible for kind of coordinating, running the Warren Commission, overseeing it? Alan Dulles, the guy who JFK fired and who hates him. But forget all that. Continue on with the story about Wasson, because now back to the thing. You got the haircut. You drive up there with the Lincoln. They're bringing you trays. You're the key guy. You're the point guy. You're the most beautiful person who's going to glorify our great Gordon Wasson. And suddenly you're starting to get that sinking feeling in your stomach as you realize there's another part of the story that you're not so comfortable with.
Exactly. Yeah. No, also we have to, kind of insert here that this is post 9/11.
This is post 9/11 for you? This is.
Yeah. Well, when I was in the Wasson archives, this was, I was in New York City on 9/11. That was a big day. And then, it was in the winter of 2002. February, I think it was, when I spent that month in the Wasson archives. And I find out his relationship with Dulles and Kennan and all these guys, and realize, this is a really important piece of information here. I wasn't really sure, what I was going to do with it here. I was just kind of chewing on it for a while. And then another big chunk comes to me. We mentioned this researcher who's a very tenacious and angry young man, Jan Irvin, who started calling me with this information about Wasson and CIA, and he's a very angry guy about how the whole psychedelic movement is a CIA conspiracy, and he's like talking very fast and very angry. And at first I just had to put him off. Like I just wasn't interested, and his tone was belligerent, and but he was, he kept calling. So, finally he asked me if I would read his book, and he had written a book about Wasson and John Allegro. And I found the book excellent. And so I started to develop a rapport with Jan. And then he finally sends me some documents. And these documents are the pay requisitions for MK Ultra subproject number 58, which is the Wasson expedition to Mexico. And it kind of lays it out that the official story that Wasson had repeated as late as 1985 when I interviewed him, which is available in my first book, a piece that I'm still very proud of, a thorough at that point, interview of his life. And I asked him about the CIA, and he basically lied to me. He said he repeated this official story that the CIA had kind of secretly infiltrated his expedition, and that he didn't really want to work with the CIA, and that they snuck in, and that they were going to try to control the whole thing and use it for their purposes. But there we got these pay requisitions that a very good researcher, Colin Ross, had unearthed, that shows that this Life magazine story was not just a hobby of a banker telling a story about a discovery he made, but this was a CIA operation. The CIA paid for the trip. They didn't just pay for the trip. They paid for all the expensive photographic equipment, the recordings, the audio recordings, and the publication of it in Henry Luce's life, Henry Luce, Skull and Bones. The CIA very deliberately, secretly, systematically exposes this. The CIA wanted millions of Americans to know about this mushroom that caused these visions. That's a game changer for me, and why they were keeping this secret. And this is the question that those of us that are fascinated by these drugs, this is what we should be asking ourselves. Why does the CIA want to ignite this psychedelic movement?
Robert, full stop there. It's a really super important point, and it's something we've explored on the show. And I don't know if you had a chance to listen to the interview I had with Joe Atwell, who I think did a lot of that research with Jan Irvin. Deserves credit where credit is due, but he's also a nitwit when it comes to consciousness, and it kind of totally shades, I think, his whole thing, because it's back to this. If you don't understand that there is a spiritual dimension to this, and if you don't want to go spiritual, at least go to as far as saying there's an extended consciousness reality. So, again, jumping all over the place. When Rick Strassman is actually a sanctioned academic researcher and he gives people DMT under controlled situations, they're entering into the extended realm, and they're seeing ET, and they're seeing the purple dragon that the shaman are seeing in South America. And now all bets are off. So no matter what the CIA or, Alan Dulles thought they were doing, the best evidence I think we have is that they didn't know what the fuck they were doing either. They went into it kind of with this mechanistic, materialistic idea of how consciousness works, and they were not aware of the deeper truth. So, and I mentioned Joe Atwell because I think Joe Atwell does a nice job of, he has a hard time getting off of the social engineering thing, because when you really look at the extent to which that social engineering project has been forced upon us, and we're like rats in a maze, it's very oppressive, and you want to throw it off. But I love where you sit in this, and that's where I think is really, I really want to understand how you're juggling these two things, because what I hear from Wasson is this both and kind of thing. Yeah, he's a lion-ass CIA lifetime player, yes, but I also get the sense that he's someone who either before, during, or after is woken up to the larger reality that he's kind of been, that he's stumbled into, or that he's been pushed into, or however, I mean, those are the two aspects. How are you playing with those two, Robert?
Well, I'm glad you put it that way, because I'm still kind of, I think back to my meetings with Wasson. He had a very peculiar personality around me. I mean, I think there was some genuine affection and respect for me as a young man who really wanted to understand what was going on. Like he was withholding, like he had a secret. He couldn't really tell it. There was an innocence about him, a gentleness about him. He's also, again, kind of near the end of his life. I don't really know. I'd really love to go back into his archives and read more of his letters. But I gave a lecture in New York shortly after my realization of his relationship to the American fascists and then my access to the archives was denied. And I can't get back in there. And I think it's very difficult to get in there to read his archives and these letters to find out. But this is a really important question that I've discussed with colleagues, like, well, maybe Wasson, like when I asked him in the interview, which again, I would urge your readers, your listeners to check out. It's an interesting piece. It's in my first book, Entheogens and the Future of Religion. There may be a copy online, or if you want it, you can contact me and I'll send you a version. When Wasson found the mushrooms, shortly thereafter, his wife dies of cancer and he retires from banking. He gets out of Wall Street. And so maybe that's an indication that he, did get turned on and he had a religious awakening, and maybe he did have a political shift. I'm trying to give the guy a benefit of the doubt because I had a sense of something human about him. And like all these guys, Tim did some really nefarious, fucked up shit, but there's a human being in there that I'm relating to. And I'm trying to help move this movement along too,
Yes.
Because they're revving up MK Ultra again. There are millions of people that are being seduced by this coordinated
yada, yada, yada. I'm with you on all that. But before we go too far down there, and I don't want to yank this too hard in another direction, so you pull it back anytime you want. But
yeah.
It's curious to me what you say. I mean, if we look at the larger spiritual structure of things and how we think things might work, we're all these chess pieces that are put on the board and we're not sure whether we're being moved or whether we're moving our own piece, and you talk about Tim Leary and how he was set up for this and set up to be the iconoclast. And I look at you, Robert, and I look at who you are at the time that you meet Wasson. And anyone who wants to go and read your extraordinary book in so many ways, Entheogens and the Future of Religion, I mean, you at that point had tapped into a beautiful aspect of this that can't be denied, and that is the religious, spiritual experience that people have connected to this, and the deeper spirituality of set and setting, of transformation, not necessary to have that spiritual transformation, but in some cases for some people can be a catalyst to that. And I'm just saying, This is that person. Someone who goes and reads that book will get a sense of where your head's at. And you're the person who rolls up in the Lincoln and talks to Wasson, who represents the two sides, the light and the dark. It just is too poetic to think that you're that guy put in, and you still are in this history. Like you say, you're still trying to figure out how to take this movement or how to take just this whole history forward. I don't know. I'm throwing a lot of stuff there, but when you chew on that, what is your role in all this? Yeah, well, I don't really know, Alex, but I'd like you to write my biography. That's one thing I'm sure of. No, I know. I've been going, I just turned, my astrologer friends, point out that I've just gone through my second Saturn return. And it was really like around my first Saturn return that I began to really explore this stuff very deeply. And now I do feel like it's a kind of obligation of mine to just write my memoirs. In fact, I did just get a contract with a German publisher for a book that's going to come out next year, where I'm going to try to tell some of these stories. There's a lot of aspects here because we have the full spectrum of human experience, as you've noted, the very powerful, mystical importance of these revelatory experiences. But there are also the psychotomimetic and mind control aspects of these experiences that are, and so in this sense, like the field of psychedelic drugs is really like a microcosm of the whole history of religion, because it's the same thing. I mean, look at the history of religion. Look at like the history of Christianity. I happen to accept Joe Atwill's thesis that it was a mind control operation from the beginning, that Jesus was a literary invention. But I'm totally with you. I can't resist throwing in there because that throws people for a total loop. Hey, even if you don't do a full Atwill on that, I just encourage anyone to One, look at Josephus, which is, I think, a huge contribution that Atwell makes, and look at that biography and say, does that really make sense? If you were truly weren't looking at it from a Christian perspective, would you really buy that story of who Josephus is? And then look at the fact that the Bible is pro-Roman. How does the Bible wind up being pro-Roman unless there's a Roman influence? And then the other great contribution Atwell makes is, if you can't swallow all that, and that doesn't even touch the historical Jesus thing per se. It just says that what that event turns out to be as it's passed on to us through the Bible is purely a psyop, is purely a control mechanism. And then I love how he just flashes forward to Constantine, Saint Constantine, who turns the entire population into slaves. And he calls it serfdom. And he says, don't worry, though, I'm giving you this religion, and it's called Christianity. And I just can't resist throwing the one other thing I always throw in there because it relates directly to your point. If this happens at 400 AD, if they are that sophisticated at playing the game, where are they at today? I mean,
far more sophisticated with a lot more powerful technologies to inculcate these mind control principles. We have the internet, we have television, we have movie screens, we have these powerful drugs, and they're just much more advanced. But that also means that the potential to turn this thing against them and to actually turn it into a kind of liberation movement is also that much more exciting. It seems to me that I don't, sometimes we talk about these kind of conspiracy theories and people think it's all doom and gloom and paranoid stuff. No, it's a really fantastic opportunity to learn from these mistakes and to use this power in a way that really does empower individuals and help us bring about a more sustainable society. I still have that wish.
Absolutely. Hey, Robert, can I pull you? You've been so fantastic. Again, I only hope people can follow whatever trail you can out of this. But I'm going to throw one other thing on the table because I feel a spiritual connection with Neem Karoli Baba. And I don't know why, I don't know how, but I found myself in tears on an airplane reading the accounts of his life as recorded by Ram Dass. So Ram Dass, Richard Alpert is an interesting figure in this whole thing. And I was wondering, because there's an interview with him that appears in your book with Timothy Leary. That's another turn on this. And I think it provides some firsthand accounts of an alternative way of looking at this expanded consciousness and the role that drugs might play in it. So just start wherever you want with Ram Dass and then allow me to kind of jump in. But we got to get to the story where, Ram Dass, and let's tell the truth, Ram Dass has outed himself as being a little bit pretty wild and crazy because he's a closeted homosexual man and trying to lead this life, and it leads to all sorts of psychosis that is too bad that a lot of people in that situation had to go through, and who knows what else is going on in his life. But he's kind of a lost soul, and he gets this LSD, but he packs it up and goes to India, and he meets Neem Karoli Baba. And I do want to get to the point where he gives a whole handful of this stuff to Neem Karoli Baba, and he places it on his tongue and says, it doesn't do anything to me because I've already been there. I can do that with my consciousness because that's where our consciousness can take us. But if you want to go there with your medicine, okay. But, he raises another question in terms of this whole thing, in terms of where we're really trying to go with this stuff. So there I've laid more on the table than maybe I should have. But any thoughts on Ram Dass?
Well, okay. So that's another fairly complicated part of the story. I didn't get to know Richard or Ram Dass until the 1990s or so. And he's one of the most likable and funny and, delicious people to be around. And I got to spend, not a lot of time with him, but we had some very close mutual friends, in particular a woman named Nina Graboy. And, I have some connection with Richard. I first got to know him kind of through the eyes of Frank Barron. And let's see, what do I want to say here? Because I have a lot of respect for him and I really like him. And I've tried to talk with him about some of these things. That interview, that long interview that's in my Leary book, is really a much shorter version of a much longer conversation that I haven't published. Because like that famous incident. Well, here's how I look at it. Okay, so here's Richard Alpert. He didn't start the Harvard psilocybin project with Tim. Frank Barron started the project with Tim, and Frank left because it got too outrageous. An embarrassing thing happened. Frank went back to Berkeley. Tim wanted someone else to work with, so he kind of latched on to Alpert. Not for any great reasons that he was like some, spiritual person or something. It's because he had an airplane and he had a Mercedes and he had some Harvard, he was a Harvard professor. He was a tenure track guy, and he had a big crush on Tim. So he was, and Richard will say this in the interview, I'll talk about, he said, when you talk about Tim and I at Harvard, I was really a very minor character at Harvard. He just kind of followed Tim around and did what he said, basically. He washed the dishes. He flew him around in his plane. He just listened. He was just so excited and happy to be there, but he didn't really have much input. And then it's really Richard that got fired from Harvard, for some really embarrassing stuff. They had agreements not to use the drugs with undergraduates, and it was the terms of the grant and the permissions. And Richard violated all those agreements. He was using drugs with undergraduates. He was having sexual relationships with undergraduates. That's really embarrassing. It's illegal. It's unethical. It's a shameful thing to do. I mean, I've been a university professor. It's against the law. It's improper. You just don't do that.
Kind of everybody knew about it too, right? I mean, he was really.
Yeah. So here's a guy. He gets fired from Harvard for this terrible stuff. Then they go to the Millbrook estate, and he kind of gets them kicked out of Millbrook too, because he's just too outrageous with his sexual, blah, blah, blah. And then so he's kind of in a little impasse in his life. He goes to India because Allen Ginsberg went to India. Again, he didn't really have any great spiritual curiosity or something. He just kind of went to India. So in India, he falls in love with somebody, this big, surfer guy, Michael Riggs, name is Bhagwan Das, who's actually a person who's, I've sat down, had long conversation with about this. Michael takes him to meet Neem Karoli. Now, I know you have this love for Neem Karoli, but I'm really suspicious of these guru guys, and I've done a little research and talked to other people that have been there. This gets controversial and people call me names, but Neem Karoli was like kind of I wonder, and this is what Michael kind of imparted, he was kind of a trickster, charlatan sort of guy too. And this famous story about Ram Dass giving him the LSD and him taking it and saying it didn't really do anything, that's, according to Michael and to other people that were there, that's not really what happened. That Neem Karoli played tricks on people. Like he had some of his guys sneak into Ram Dass's room when he wasn't around and go through his personal stuff. And he would find out personal things about Ram Dass and then trick him into thinking he was being psychic about him. And that he didn't actually take the LSD. He palmed it, and he gave it to he ground it up and put it in the prasad, the holy food. So his devotees would take it and have altered states of consciousness and think that the guru was really so incredibly powerful. And so now you got this guy, Richard Alpert, who's fired from Harvard, then he falls for this phony guru. Then he puts together this book, Be Here Now, which is, okay, I know a lot of people, that was their first introduction to kind of Buddhist or yogic ideals and Be Here Now. But look, I'm sorry if this sounds harsh or something, but it's a little cut up thing of spiritual platitudes. And a guy that's really never done any kind of real meditation. He's a bhakti yogi. He went from being an authoritarian, agreeing and obeying with all the Harvard authorities, to being kind of just accept. Then Tim was his authority, and now this Neem Karoli guy is the authority. And then he comes back to the United States. He falls for some woman, Guru Joya or something, who bleeds from her ears, who he's a kind of embarrassing thing. And like somehow with all like this series of embarrassing stuff, gets himself defined as a spiritual teacher. Well, like what's spiritual? Like what does that mean? Really, a best-selling book of platitudes and this series of embarrassing stuff. And he's a very, very articulate and funny and charming guy. And, we've even sort of talked about this. I told him Michael's version of the story that he faked. Michael told that to me. And that it was, and Ram Dass said, this is before his stroke, that he said, well, I don't know, that's Bhagavan's version. This is mine. I'm just trying to tell the truth as I see it.
Let me add a couple parts to the story as I know it. And I'm not married to the story. I'm not married to any version of it. And I've never met Neem Karoli Baba. So it's like people that talk about their personal relationship with Jesus from Christ consciousness standpoint. And I can't get in the middle of that. If you have a relationship with Jesus, fucking A, go for it. That's awesome.
I guess. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I think that's undeniable. And I mean, to get me sidetracked, if you look at the near-death experience science, right? So take it, I like the word science there, because if we take the neurological model that we have, we say that when your heart stops, there is no possibility for any coherent brain activity within about 15 seconds of after that. So whether you believe the brain is dead after that point or whatever, but then if we go in and scientifically study the recollections and perceptions that people have, and we tie them back to their ability to recount their resuscitation and other stuff, I'm going through this really quickly because people on this show have heard it a million times. There's a set of science there that suggests consciousness survives bodily death in a way that our modern medicine still can't come to grips with, and talks about in these silly, neurological shit that's just total bullshit thing. So I digress greatly because I'm back to just saying when those people have a near-death experience and they connect with Jesus, Christ consciousness, whatever that is, and I don't know what that is, and I don't want to pretend to, but there's a reality to this extended spiritual experience, and I think we're both on the same page. So I roll that all the way back to saying, if somebody has a connection to Neem Karoli Baba, I honor that without having to pass judgment on whether it's true or false, or whether he's a charlatan, or whether he's a Sai Baba who we can watch videos of, who, so many people just revere. And I've had some scholars on this show who've written books about parapsychology, and they're highly esteemed, and they fall for Sai Baba. And it's like, well, shit, slow down the goddamn video and you can see he's palming the pendant. Yeah, so what's going on there? But the other complexity of that is, people talk about Uri Geller too, and they say the same thing. Well, look, he's a stage magician. He's faking. Yes, he's faking, but he's also really done it too. And here's my interview with Jacques Vallée, where he says, I was sitting at the table with him and I did the mind experiment, and he, you know what I mean? So we always are going to have that trickster element in this multi-shaded, that's part of the fun of this thing too. But back to Neem Karoli Baba and back to the story, as I've heard it from Ram Dass, is he goes back to the United States and he has these doubts. Did this guy really take the LSD? Did he palm it? Did he throw it over his shoulder? So he comes back next time and he sees Neem Karoli Baba. And before he says anything, Neem Karoli Baba says to him, come here.
Got any more of those pills?
Yeah. He says, yeah, you had doubts. You think I'm fake? He goes, he sticks out his tongue. Now, this is the story, whether you believe it or not. But there were other witnesses to it too, right? So he sticks out his tongue. He says, you place them on my tongue. You make sure. Now give me a glass of water or milk or whatever it was. And he drinks it. And he says, okay, you're satisfied that I've taken them. He goes, now I'll sit there. And this is how he tells the story. So at least he's either an elaborate liar or there's some truth to it. He said, then about 20 minutes later, Neem Karoli Baba starts going into all these like convulsions with his face, and they're thinking, oh shit, man, the old man, he was faking it. And now he's really gotten the dose and he's tripping really hard. And then he just smiles and he says, oh, okay, that's not it. I'm just playing around with you. Yeah, we used to know about this medicine, these people, these yogis back in the valley used to know about it, blah, blah, blah. But again, the important thing to me is he says, which I think is a truth that I hold on to because I see it in so many different ways from different spiritual masters, is that, hey, if you need this medicine to help remind you who you are, to help remind you of your divinity, then okay. But don't you already know the answer? Isn't the real challenge in living it, in telling the truth, in being genuinely who you are, in loving other people? Isn't that really the challenge? The challenge isn't knowing that you're more. You know you're more. So, and then I also take with that, all the other stories, because the first book I read from Ram Dass was not Be Here Now. It was Miracle of Love. And it's all these, a compilation, if you acknowledge or believe the story of how how this book comes to being, it's a compilation of stories from all these different people that have encountered Neem Karoli Baba. And some of them are Indians who've been there for, known him as 20, 30 years. Other are these Americans that have kind of visited him. And then also, you can go listen to Krishna Das. Krishna Das is, he's a famous, sure, yeah. Right. So he has his own experience with Neem Karoli Baba, but many of the details match up with what Ram Dass is saying. And also, I live right here in Southern California, like I was telling you, and I live 7 miles from the Self-Realization Fellowship, and I had some kind of strange connection where I was, I don't know. I was a kid starting a business, entrepreneur, and somehow or another I get into yoga and I read this book, Autobiography of a Yogi, and I start sending off these correspondence classes that are coming from 7 miles from where I live right now. And although I never got into the whole Self-Realization Fellowship thing too much, anyone can go take that book and read the first 30 pages, and it makes all the miracles, quote unquote, that Ram Dass is talking about are child's play. And then I just interviewed a guy a couple episodes ago named Steve Briggs, who spent 20 years as a TM meditation teacher and was sent to, and there's a whole story behind that trickster, Maharishi and that whole thing. But he still has this extraordinary experience of going to India for 20 years and meeting these Indian, and I'm not big on the sage on the stage thing either, but there's just too much there in terms of a reality to people who have ability to access this higher consciousness. So there I've just thrown a ton of shit on the table too, and I don't know what's true and what isn't true, but I wanted to add that part of the story.
Yeah, well, it's all so very interesting. Again, it leads to a really long conversation, and it's making me think, because we started talking about Leary, and now we're on to Ram Dass, and how really very, very different these two characters are, and how they both embody very opposite aspects of religion and the religious experience. And, my friend Gay Dillingham did a brilliant and important film that's been out and about called Dying to Know, which was a conversation between Tim and Ram Dass.
Yeah, I've seen it.
Yeah, you've seen it. Okay, so in that film, so here's these two guys. Now, religion, Tim was a revolutionary. Tim grew up, Tim didn't have any money. Tim wanted to change the world. He believed in democracy. He didn't like that the money was all concentrated at the top and most of the people didn't have any and they were controlled by he was an Irish fighting the English. He wanted to see a more equal distribution of wealth and power in the society and having a democracy. Ram Dass is a totally different character. And for him,
yeah, right. Hold on. You're really onto something there, right? I'm seeing this in a whole new light, because let's just expound on that a little bit. Ram Dass is a rich kid. I mean, he is a rich-ass kid from Harvard, privileged, and then when he goes and does the guru thing, it's, hey, everybody, come out to my dad's, fucking 45-acre estate, kind of thing, right?
Yep. Tim is constantly reminding him and the viewer how different they are. It's the last line of the movie. We're different. We're different. And so here again, is religion a conservative force that is like a mind control operation by elites to pacify and control the masses, like Huxley warned about in Brave New World, and more acutely wrote about in an essay that's nowhere near as well known, that I would encourage our listeners to check out, Brave New World Revisited, which is a postscript to Brave New World that he wrote in 1958. So here you see this kind of embodied in Tim, who's really trying to, he's anti-war, he's arrested, he's a problem to the establishment. Ram Dass is not a problem to the establishment. Ram Dass is exactly what the establishment wants. It's a kind of feel-good bhakti religion. You're not going to change the structure of society or the distribution of wealth or power. Why bother?
Well, but that's tricky. That's really tricky. I mean, we can play with that on two different dimensions, right? We can play with that on the political dimension, and it looks one way, and we can play with the bhakti path on and bhakti is service, right? So bhakti is love, right? Bhakti is love. Yeah. Bhakti is the love path. Like, one thing jumps to mind there is that many folks in the yogic tradition will tell you, you can go as far as you want down the path of the warrior, the Timothy Leary warrior. But at some point, to get past the final hurdle, you're going to need the guru. And us in the West don't accept the guru. And I am not a guru fucking guy. Nowhere close. Never have been, never have. That's just not me. I'm the iconoclast person. That's my nature. But I do see the wisdom of submitting. There is a wisdom to submitting, as much as it pulls against who I am, kind of thing. And in that respect, you're saying something really beautiful and deep there, Robert, in terms of how these two guys who bring forth this whole experience of psychedelics are representing two aspects that ultimately lead to the same place, if we will, in terms of higher consciousness. And I don't know. I hate to shut it off and pull it back down to this materialistic kind of. We have to do that sometimes, when we talk about the CIA and the mind control. But I think these guys are also playing on a whole different level, a higher level. What, any thoughts on?
You mean Tim and Richard? Or?
Yeah. I mean, they're playing on the psycho-spiritual kind of dimension too, that totally transcends anything that these guys want to do in terms of playing around with, trying to control people and all the rest of that. I mean, not to shift gears too far again, because it's going to drive people nuts, but I was listening to Whitley Strieber recently, and him talking about how he had firsthand experience with the mind control, horrible mind control program that he was subjected to when he was like 9 years old in San Antonio, Texas. And these guys, this is MK Ultra, like in its worst, taking these little kids and putting them in Skinner boxes and sensory deprivation, in order to crack them open to see if they could, because we know when people are in, like people who are subjected to trauma, crack open and reach these other dimensions, whether they be psychic or out of body travel or whatever they were. And they were playing around with this shit because they're like, hey man, we got to figure out that part of it too, kind of thing. But what he said just really stuck with me from a spiritual side. He said, these guys don't realize what they're doing to their soul. And I don't know how comfortable you are with that, or how comfortable you are with the idea of reincarnation and karma at this much higher level, rather than this kind of dime store, do this, don't do that kind of thing. And, I wonder at the soul level who these actors are, Timothy Leary, Ram Dass. And it seems to me like they're like right out of some mythical Indian story of, like you're saying, good and bad, and the follower and the leader and the soldier and the warrior. And have you processed that? You obviously have, because you've kind of led me there.
Yep. No, I drafted a screenplay once where I had the psychedelic scenario that we've been talking about, Wasson and Hoffman, and these were characters. You can find them, there's Giordano Bruno and Galileo, and, it's the same drama in different epics, right? Jesus and so on. Yeah, no, it's the same story. You're right. No, they're mythic archetypal characters, and they knew it. They knew it, and they played it to the hilt. Ram Dass still does. Again, I'm saying that in a, he would.
Right. Just, hey.
Yeah. And the question for me, again, though, like I'm not quite, you said something a little bit ago about, they're at the same kind of consciousness, and I'm not sure that I agree with that, because I think that the political, earth-centered consciousness is different than the transcendental consciousness. And that you look at the history of spiritual techniques, like, say, Theravadan Buddhism, the mystical experience doesn't come really till the end of the practice. If it comes too early, it's considered a corruption. It's something like don't go to that, because you get sort of blissed out. Or in the Hindu version, there's a wonderful phrase that I repeat a lot when I talk about this: ashrama dharma. Ashrama dharma, which means the truth about the stages of life. Yoga was a technique that came later in life, in your renunciate or sannyasin phase. A society falls apart if the warriors become mystics too soon, because the society needs to have a structure to it. And this might have been the psychological operation of the psychedelic movement. My metaphor is the culture got fairy dust thrown at it, and people are like blissing out and going off into these, we're going to levitate the Pentagon. Levitate the Pentagon? No, that's not how you end war. You don't levitate Pentagons. You organize politically, you realize what these guys are doing, you smarten up, you discipline yourself. You are in the world. You're not levitating things here.
Well, maybe I get where you're coming from, and I cannot dismiss that. There are other sides of that. One, from this worldish kind of standpoint, we have to be fair about the agenda and the power that we've given these people. And, you were talking about the manifest destiny of the United States and the superiority and stuff like that. And, we can argue that. We could talk about that compared to what, I don't want to live in North Korea. I don't want to live in Apple's Chicom factories. I don't want to live in Russia. So I don't like some of the stuff that you're talking about and where it might go. But that's a whole different game. That's I want you on that wall, I need you on that wall kind of game. And I love having those discussions, and I love going there. But I also want to throw some rocks at this idea of romanticizing Indian mystical culture and even yogic understanding of some of this stuff. Because some of it's just bullshit. I love the Timothy Leary, 1/3 of it's bullshit. It's like, hey, people have spontaneous Kundalini awakenings all the time. And I don't know why God allows that. I was like, throw God in there because it throws people off. But I interviewed a woman a long time ago, what's her name? Hazel Courtney. She, just as an example, though, she's a writer for the London Times, like a straight of the line journalist. She has an incredible psychic experience of Kundalini awakening and starts being hyper psychic, starts being able to have these weather phenomena that people talk about. I mean, these things are all over the place when you start looking for them. And she didn't go looking for this. This came looking for her. I just interviewed a couple episodes ago a medium who is been tested by, I think, one of the best people in the country from University of Arizona, Dr. Julie Beischel, has tested and controlled medium communication, published peer-reviewed journal, and she says this woman passes all the tests. There she is telling me about how she's just going about her life, and suddenly she has traumatic experiences of her mother dying and I think her sister dying in a short period of time, and lo and behold, boom, dead spirits start showing up and telling her, do this, do that. So this idea, I've heard that the Indian, this is how we live our life in the first quarter and the second quarter. Throw all that shit out the window, because it isn't happening like that for everybody.
Not for everybody. No, spirituality is not democratic. That's a line from one of my teachers, Houston Smith, that we have to, it's a very tricky conversation in this culture because, these other realms do exist. These magical, mystical things, kundalini, psychic, near-death experiences. And what may be right for someone at one time in their life, expansive and healing, can be very destructive and very confusing, the same kind of experience to another person.
And it may be out of their control. That's, I guess, what I'm throwing in, because yes, with the introduction of psychedelics where at least I appear to be able to control that, there's other experiences that are on par with it in terms of transformative that seem to be outside of our control. And that kind of throws a wrench in the whole thing too.
Well, we could go on, Alex.
We can, and you've been so incredibly generous with your time. Robert, you've mentioned some of the projects that you're involved with in terms of very exciting stuff, in terms of writing a book maybe about your incredible life, also maybe a screenplay. What will people, get out of the books that you've already written, and then what new projects are you working on?
Well, I just have these couple of projects now. I've started to work on this book for the German publishers with Matthias Breukers, who is a best-selling author in Germany. He's considered Europe's foremost conspiracy theorist. He wrote one of the first best-selling books on 9/11. And I'm really honored that he asked me to collaborate with him. So that's a new project. I have a screenplay that I've been, as we can tell from this conversation, this is a very hard story to put into an arc. So I struggle with that. But I'm mostly kind of retired up here in the Santa Cruz Mountains. I work a little bit in the cannabis business. And I don't even have my own webpage. There's an academic webpage. I'm an adjunct faculty at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. My views are controversial. Sometimes they send a student my way. I will encourage anybody that's listening, if they want to, I sort of blog a bit on Facebook, so you can reach me there. We can carry on this discussion that way. How's that?
That's perfect. Our guest has been Robert Forte, an incredible person, and we'll keep an eye out for those projects that you're working on, because there's a life story here that must be told, and I can't imagine how fun it would be to see it in some kind of screenplay, because there's an artistic part of this that might contribute to the storytelling. Robert, again, thank you so much for joining me and for having this kind of conversation.
Alex, thanks a lot. I've enjoyed it. Look forward to meeting you someday. I enjoy your podcast, and I'm wishing you lots of good luck.
Thanks again to Robert Forte for joining me today on Skeptiko. The one question I tee up from this interview has to do with entheogens. It's something we've kicked around many times, and I guess I've gone back and forth, but I'm wondering what you think about the role of entheogens and spirituality. I know this is a topic we've touched on many times, but as you know, going through this interview, there's a lot of different aspects to it, and it doesn't hurt to return to it over and over again. So are entheogens giving us a glimpse of the divine, or are they clouding our vision of it? Let me know your thoughts. Skeptiko Forum is one way to do it. Send me an email, of course, is another way. And all that good stuff you can find at the Skeptiko website, skeptiko.com. All the shows there are available free for download. I hope you enjoyed this show. If you did, let me know. If you think there's someone who needs to hear it, please pass it along to them. I have a couple of really good ones coming up in the near future, so do stick around for all of that. Until next time, take care and bye for now. So thanks for watching this video, and if it wasn't really a video, but just an audio, stored as a video, I apologize. But there's more videos out there as well. But please check out the Skeptiko website. You can see it here. We cover a lot of different stuff you might be interested in relating to controversial science and spirituality. A lot of shows up there, over 350 of them or so, all free, all available for download. So do check it out.